In this episode, we focus on model validation, which is the disciplined work of proving that an artificial intelligence, AI, model behaves well enough to be trusted in the real world. Validation is different from simply getting a model to run, because a model can run smoothly and still be dangerous, inaccurate, or easy to manipulate. New learners often assume that if the model produces answers that sound smart, then it must be correct, but sounding confident is not the same as being right. Validation is how you turn a model from an impressive demo into a dependable system component. It is also how you discover the ways the model can fail before real users discover them first, when the cost of failure is higher. The goal is to test for safety, accuracy, and security failure modes in a structured way that produces evidence, not vibes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to define what validation means in practice. Validation is a set of planned checks that compare what the model does against what you need it to do, including what it must never do. It asks whether the model meets accuracy expectations for the tasks it supports, whether it behaves safely when confronted with risky or sensitive situations, and whether it resists security threats that try to push it into unsafe behavior. Validation also asks whether the model behaves consistently across different kinds of inputs, rather than performing well on easy cases and failing on real ones. Beginners sometimes mix up validation with training, but training is how you create behavior, while validation is how you judge behavior. Training can make a model better, but validation tells you whether it is good enough and where it is still weak. That distinction matters because a model can improve in one dimension while degrading in another, and validation is how you catch that trade-off. Safety validation is about preventing harm, and harm can take many forms in AI systems. Harm can mean exposing sensitive information, providing dangerous guidance, producing biased or unfair outputs, or encouraging actions that mislead users. Safety validation checks how the model behaves when asked questions that touch privacy, sensitive topics, or real-world decisions. It also checks how the model behaves when a user tries to trick it, confuse it, or pressure it into breaking rules. A beginner misconception is that safety is only about blocking obvious bad content, but safety also includes subtle failures, like confidently giving wrong medical or legal advice, or making up facts that sound plausible. Safety validation should therefore test realistic user behavior, including messy prompts, partial information, and emotional language. A safe model is not one that never answers, but one that answers responsibly within boundaries. Accuracy validation is about whether the model is correct and useful for the specific job you intend. Accuracy is not a universal score that applies everywhere, because a model can be accurate for one type of question and unreliable for another. Accuracy validation starts by defining what correct looks like, which can mean matching known facts, following correct procedures, or classifying inputs consistently. It also includes checking whether the model explains uncertainty appropriately, because in many domains the most accurate behavior is to admit limitations rather than invent an answer. Beginners often assume accuracy is binary, but real accuracy lives on a spectrum, and the acceptable level depends on how the output will be used. If the output is only a suggestion for a human to review, you can tolerate more uncertainty than if the output triggers automated actions. Validation therefore connects accuracy to risk, because higher impact uses require stronger accuracy evidence. One reason validation is challenging in AI is that models can fail in ways that look reasonable at first glance. A model might give an answer that is mostly right, but contains one critical mistake that a beginner would not notice. A model might produce a confident explanation that hides the fact it misunderstood the question. A model might behave differently depending on tiny wording changes, which is a warning sign that it is not stable. For a large language model, LLM, this can show up as invented details, inconsistent reasoning, or answers that shift based on the tone of the prompt. Validation must therefore include checks for consistency and robustness, not only checks for correctness on one phrasing of a question. Beginners should learn to treat a model like a student taking an oral exam, where you ask the same idea in different ways to see whether understanding is real or accidental. Consistency is a form of reliability, and reliability is a security concern because unreliable systems invite misuse and mistakes. Security failure modes are the third pillar, and they focus on how the model and its surrounding system can be attacked or exploited. A security failure mode is a way the system can be pushed into violating confidentiality, integrity, or availability, even if the model appears to function normally. Confidentiality can fail if sensitive information leaks through outputs or logs. Integrity can fail if the model output can be manipulated to produce harmful decisions or to hide malicious activity. Availability can fail if the model service can be overwhelmed or disrupted. Beginners often think of security as breaking into systems, but in AI, security failures can also come from manipulating inputs, abusing integrations, or exploiting weak access control around the model. Validation for security failure modes checks whether the model can be induced to reveal protected information, whether it follows rules under pressure, and whether it can be used as a stepping stone into other systems through its integrations. A practical way to approach security validation is to think in terms of misuse cases, meaning scenarios where a user or attacker tries to get the model to do something it should not. This could include trying to extract hidden context, trying to bypass safety constraints, or trying to produce outputs that can be used for harm. The key is that misuse does not always look like an obvious attack. It can look like a normal user asking clever follow-up questions, repeating requests, or disguising intent. Validation should therefore include adversarial style testing, where you intentionally probe boundaries to see where they break. Beginners should not be intimidated by the word adversarial, because the idea is simple. If people will eventually try to misuse the system, you should be the first person to try. When you find weaknesses early, you can treat them as design problems instead of emergency incidents. Validation also needs to consider the full context in which the model operates, not just the model in isolation. Many AI systems include retrieval from documents, access to tools, or integration with workflows that can amplify risk. If the model can retrieve internal documents, validation must check whether it can retrieve data it should not, and whether it exposes that data in outputs. If the model can trigger actions, validation must check whether outputs can be crafted to cause unintended actions or unsafe automation. Even if the model itself is cautious, the system can still fail if downstream components trust the output too much. Beginners should understand that model validation is often system validation in disguise, because a model can be safe in a vacuum and unsafe in a real pipeline. The most effective validation reflects real deployment conditions, including the data sources, user roles, and monitoring that will exist in production. To make validation meaningful, you need clear criteria, because vague criteria produce vague results. For safety, criteria might include refusing to reveal restricted information, avoiding harmful guidance, and behaving consistently when asked to cross boundaries. For accuracy, criteria might include correct answers on representative tasks, consistent performance across variations, and appropriate handling of uncertainty. For security, criteria might include resistance to manipulation attempts and protection of sensitive context and logs. Criteria are not meant to be perfect, but they must be specific enough that different evaluators would reach similar conclusions. Beginners sometimes fear that criteria will limit creativity, but criteria actually protect you from being fooled by a model that is charming and fluent while quietly wrong. Validation criteria turn the conversation from opinions into evidence, and evidence is what governance needs to approve releases responsibly. Another important part of validation is selecting test data and test prompts that reflect reality rather than only easy cases. If you validate with only clean, well-structured inputs, you will overestimate performance because real users are not always clear. Real inputs include typos, incomplete details, emotional language, mixed intent, and ambiguous questions. Real systems also face long-tail cases that are rare but high impact, such as sensitive privacy requests or unusual combinations of facts. Validation should therefore include a mix of common cases and edge cases, because safety failures often hide in the edges. Beginners should see this as practicing for the real exam rather than only practicing the sample questions. If you want confidence, you must test the conditions that will actually occur, not the conditions that make the model look best. It is also essential to think about regression, which means checking that the model does not get worse when you update it. A new model version might improve accuracy on common questions, but become less safe under pressure. It might become more helpful in tone, but more likely to invent details. It might handle one category better while failing another that matters to your organization. Validation should therefore be repeatable, meaning you can run the same checks across versions and compare results. This is how you prevent improvement in one area from silently creating new risk elsewhere. Beginners sometimes assume updates are always upgrades, but in AI, updates are changes, and change always carries risk. Regression validation is the habit that keeps releases safe over time because it catches negative drift early and supports controlled rollback when needed. Validation should also consider how humans interact with the model, because human behavior can turn a small model weakness into a larger operational problem. If users believe the model is always right, they may stop verifying outputs and start copying results into decisions. If users treat the model as authoritative, they may share sensitive information they would not share elsewhere. If users are rushed, they may accept plausible answers without questioning them. Validation can include checking whether outputs are presented in a way that encourages appropriate caution, such as signaling uncertainty or encouraging verification for high-risk topics. This is not a marketing concern. It is a safety control because the human is part of the system. Beginners should learn that security and safety are partly about designing the interaction so normal human mistakes do not become predictable failures. When validation finds problems, the response should be structured rather than emotional. First, you clarify whether the problem is about safety, accuracy, or security, because the remediation approach may differ. Next, you determine whether the issue is a model behavior problem, a data problem, or an integration and control problem around the model. Then you decide whether to fix, constrain, or redesign, because sometimes the safest choice is to reduce scope rather than forcing the model to do a task it cannot do reliably. Finally, you revalidate after changes, because fixes without revalidation are just guesses. Beginners sometimes think a single fix is enough, but validation is a loop, and the loop is what turns discovery into confidence. Over time, this loop creates a model and system that becomes safer not because they are perfect, but because weaknesses are found and managed deliberately. It is worth emphasizing that validation is not only defensive, it also creates trust that enables adoption. Leaders are more willing to approve AI systems when they can see evidence of safety and reliability. Operators are more willing to support systems when they can predict behavior and monitor effectively. Users are more likely to use systems responsibly when the system behaves consistently and does not surprise them with unsafe outputs. Validation is therefore part of building organizational confidence, not just part of avoiding failure. Beginners should recognize that the best security programs are not built on fear, they are built on proof. Proof reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty makes it easier to make clear decisions about when and how to use AI responsibly. To close, validating models for safety, accuracy, and security failure modes means you test what the model does, what it might do under pressure, and what the surrounding system allows it to do. Safety validation checks for harmful behavior, privacy exposure, and boundary violations. Accuracy validation checks whether the model is correct and reliable for the intended use, including consistency and appropriate uncertainty. Security validation checks whether misuse and manipulation can cause confidentiality, integrity, or availability failures, especially through inputs and integrations. When validation is criteria-driven, realistic, repeatable, and tied to change management, it becomes the evidence engine that supports safe releases. Task 22 expects you to understand that evidence is not optional, because without validation you are not managing risk, you are hoping risk will not find you first.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.